Hi everyone, and welcome to the Say As It Is with Pete podcast series. I'm Pete, your host, and each week I will bring you some frank and honest conversations covering various topics from learning and development, apprenticeships, funding, HR, strengths, recruitment, ESG, well-being, ED&I, employability, and much, much more. So let's get this week's episode underway and say as it is. Welcome to this week's episode of Say As It Is with Pete, as we now enter the month of May and start looking at ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. But before we kick off this week's episode, I just want to say a very big thank you to everybody that responded to my call to arms to take part in current and future podcasts. And thank you to all of those that have reached out. And I will, if I haven't already, be contacting you to get you booked in to get those recordings done. But there is still time for you to join onto a podcast. So if you are interested, then please get in touch and let's pick up that conversation. So without further ado, let's get going on this week's podcast. Well, as I say, it's May, and this topic for May is all about ESG. So over this podcast and the next couple of podcasts, we're going to look at finding out what ESG actually is, give you a bit more information, but also give you some positive improvements, advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons to ESG, and also how it can impact both in the education sector, the hospitality sector, and the corporate sector, as well as how individuals we can apply ourselves to the ESG model, and then also how we can utilize strengths within ESG. So let's get cracking and have these frank, honest conversations. So my first kind of question is, why has ESG become such a buzzword? And I hear it so much. So let's look at this a bit more. So ESG obviously stands for, or not obviously, but it does stand for Environmental, Social and Governance, and has become a buzzword in the recent years for a few reasons. Now, first of all, there seems to be a growing awareness and concern among investors, customers and other stakeholders about the impact that companies have on the environment and in society. As a result, companies are under increasing pressure to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability and responsible practices. Second, there is growing evidence that companies that perform well in ESG matrices, and that's such as EcoVadis, for example, tend to be more financially successful over the long term. And investors are starting to recognize these and are incorporating ESG considerations into their investment decisions. And this also goes into tenders as well, as a lot of companies that if you're a supplier and you're offering a service, then a lot of companies are looking at whether you have ESG. Now, finally, governments around the world are starting to take action to address issues such as climate change and social inequality, and companies that are seen as leaders in these areas are likely to benefit from favourable regulatory environments. But also, we have to think that overall, ESG has become a buzzword because it represents a shift in how companies and investors think about businesses, and it's important to have its impact on the world. It is no longer enough to focus, solely on the financial performance, but companies must also consider their broader impact on the environment and society if they want to succeed in long-term business or succeed long-term anyway. So as you can see, there is a benefit to now why ESG has become such a buzzword. And before, you'd have to create and show that you've got an environmental policy, you've got a waste policy, but now it's the biggest focus. And for example, the UN have a 17 points to ESG, which we will cover in another episode. But as you can see, this word ESG is going to be a buzzword which will never go away. So, what is this ESG and its purpose within the UK? So, ESG has three broad categories of criteria used to evaluate a company's sustainability and ethical impact. So in the UK, the purpose of ESG is to encourage companies to adopt more sustainable and responsible practices in these areas. So it looks at environmental criteria, which refers to a company's impact on the environment, including its use of natural resources, carbon footprint, waste management, and offsets to mitigate climate change, or its efforts, I should say, to climate change. So it also looks at the social side. So the social criteria evaluates a company's impact on society, including its relationship with its employees, its customers, suppliers, and communities. So this includes issues such as labour standards, human rights, diversity and inclusion, and community engagement. So like social recruitment. And then the third part of the ESG model is governance. And the governance criteria refers to a company's internal management structures and processes. So this is including, board diversity, executive compensation, and transparency in financial reporting. So in the UK, there is an increasing interest in ESG as investors, customers, and stakeholders, as mentioned before, are increasingly aware of the impact that companies have on the environment and society. So the UK government has also set ambiguous targets for reducing carbon emissions and promoting sustainability, which has put pressure on companies to adopt more sustainable practices. So the purpose of ESG in the UK, therefore, is to encourage companies to be more responsible and sustainable in their operations, which can benefit both society and the economy in the long term. And this is why a lot of companies are starting to move and show how environmentally friendly they are and how they're meeting those three elements of the environmental, social, and governance part. And it's still out there that there are lots of matrices and organizations that are helping people get their ESG grading or standard or get them to that point where they are ESG ready. So why do companies in the UK need to be more ESG compliant, and when by? I think that's a key thing as well. So companies in the UK need to be more ESG compliant for several reasons. Firstly, there is increasing pressure from, as I say, investors and customers who are demanding that companies operate in a more sustainable and responsible manner. So companies that are not seen to be taking ESG issues seriously risk losing customers and investors who are increasingly prioritizing sustainability and social responsibility. So, a lot of people, especially if you're a provider giving a service, whether it be education, hospitality, or any other business, you have to demonstrate that you are working towards or have ESG, because as it says, there are other people that have a valid interest in this and want to see you doing it. So secondly, there's an increasing regulatory environment in the UK that requires companies to take ESG issues seriously. So the UK government has set ambiguous targets for reducing carbon emissions and promoting sustainability, and companies that are not taking action on these issues can and may face or get penalties from the government, which, it's quite tough, And finally, there is increasing evidence that companies that prioritize ESG issues tend to be more financially successful in the long term, as I've already said. So this is because companies that are committed to sustainability and responsible business practices are more likely to attract better investors and clients and customers, who are looking for companies that are aligned with their values. So, in terms of when companies need to be more ESG compliant, the answer is now. Sorry, guys, it's now or never. So, companies should be taking action on ESG issues as soon as possible to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability and social responsibility. However, it's worth noting that ESG compliance is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process that requires continuous improvement and monitoring. So companies that are committed to ESG will need to continually evaluate and improve their practices to stay ahead of the curve. So again, this is not a tick box scenario, people. Once you start it and you're invested in it, that's it. It's got to keep going. So when we look at ESG, I know we've touched on it a little bit, but actually, what topics are included in ESG? Because it's not, when we look at environmental, social, and governance, I think that is the problem at the moment, because we're all looking at it, but we're not too sure. Now, I've just gone for an EcoVadis assessment with my organization, and when I saw the EcoVadis, I was kind of like, oh my God, what the hell is this? There are hundreds of questions which are asking you to demonstrate a whole plethora of things. And some things you think, hang on a minute, do we have this? Why is this even needed? But this is all part of the ESG framework and model. So you've got to think that ESG can include a wide range of topics covering environmental, social, and governance issues. Some of those key topics within ESG are things like, so when we look at environmental, this includes topics such as carbon emissions, energy efficiency, waste management, water consumption, and biodiversity. When we're looking at the social side, this includes topics such as labour standards, human rights, employee engagement, so diversity and inclusion, health and safety, and community engagement. It also can look at your social recruitment side as well. And, look, for those that know me, I attend the social recruitment advocacy group, and that's a great part of this. But it's about that social side. And then number 3, the governance. So this can include topics such as board diversity, executive compensation, shareholder rights, ethical behavior, and transparency in financial reporting. It also can contain things like career progression. It also looks at, sustainable procurement, what training you've got in regards to bribery and corruption, what cyber security you've got. So there are other topics that may be included in that ESG, especially in the UK. As I said, it could also include your GDPR, so your data privacy. As I said, your cyber security, your supply chain management, and also looking at responsible sourcing of new or raw materials. So when you're looking at purchasing something, are there certain processes you go through? What ethical audits are you doing? And it's also worth noting that the specific topics included in ESG will vary depending on the industry and the company. So companies operating in industries with a significant environmental impact, such as, say, mining or energy, may be expected to prioritize environmental issues, while companies within the service sector may be expected to prioritize social and governance issues. So overall, ESG is broad and an evolving field, and it keeps changing. It will change all the time and be updated. So companies need to stay informed about the latest developments and best practices to ensure that they are addressing the most relevant issues. So as I say, look, it covers quite a bit. So you're going to have to look at those. And even when we look at it a little bit more, so if I go dig even further into environmental, you're looking at climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You're looking at transitioning to renewable energy sources and managing your carbon footprint. It's also looking at resource efficiency, so minimizing your waste, increasing energy and water efficiency, and promoting a circular economy practices. It can also look at biodiversity. And for those that are not sure what biodiversity is, this is about protecting ecosystems and conserving natural resources and mitigating negative impacts on biodiversity. But when we also delve a little bit more into the social side, we're looking at the human rights elements. So, respecting human rights and avoiding labour and human rights violations. It's also looking at the diversity inclusion, so promoting diversity inclusion within the workplace and avoiding discrimination. So that's also within your recruitment processes, the training you offer, all those kind of things. And then the community engagement. So this is engaging with local communities, supporting social initiatives and addressing social challenges like recruiting from diverse backgrounds. And then the governance, if we look at that a little bit more, that's going into corporate governance and maintaining effective board structures, promoting transparency and ensuring ethical behavior. It's also looking at executive compensation, and what that means is about aligning executive pay with company performance and shareholder interests. And then kind of the risk management, so identifying and managing risks related to ESG issues and incorporating them into decision-making processes. So as you can see, when you dive down more and more into those three areas of ESG, there's a lot more to it than you would normally think. So, is ESG worth it or not? Well, yes and no. And I can't provide a definite yes or no whether it's worth it or not. However, I will say this: there are several reasons why companies may find it beneficial to prioritize ESG, or environmental social governance, right now. And as I said, there's four reasons why, and I'm going to go over those. So number one, it's about your investors and customers' demand. So many investors and customers are increasingly prioritizing sustainability and social responsibility when making investments and purchasing decisions. So companies that prioritize that ESG or ESG issues may be more attractive than to those stakeholders, and therefore have a competitive advantage. So if you're showing that you're investing or working towards that part, then customers will be more loyal and work towards being with you and buy and purchase from you. Second, long-term financial benefits. So companies that are prioritizing ESG may benefit from reduced costs, which can look at increased revenues and empowered brand reputation over a long term, or not empowered, but improved brand reputation, sorry. So it can help improve your brand reputation in the long term. And then regulatory compliance, which is number three. So there is an increasing regulatory environment in many countries, including the UK, that requires companies to take ESG issues seriously. So companies that fail to comply with those regulations may face fines and other penalties. So it's key that you invest in that part of it as well and look at the regulatory compliance. And there's a lot of long words for me today, and I've written the script, so do bear with me. But yes, it's best to comply because you're looking at things like human rights. And when you're looking at human rights and labor laws, you're also looking at, young people or, child labor laws and things like that. And these are all things to think about and consider, and whether they apply to your organization or not, and whether you need to review them and have them in place just in case. And then the fourth point of this is your risk management. So Addressing ESG issues can help companies identify and manage risks related to sustainability and social responsibility. So this can mitigate potential reputational damage and other negative impacts. So overall, why there may be upfront costs associated with prioritizing ESG, there are many potential benefits that companies may find valuable in the long term. And look, there is a cost. There are lots of different assessment tools out there, and I've mentioned EcoVadis, for example. And if you want to get in touch and talk a little bit more about EcoVadis, then please do. And I'm more than happy to give you some advice and guidance and talk you through it. But again, that's a great assessment tool to see where you are now and what you need to do to improve and get yourself to a high level of showing that you're prioritizing ESG. So it's key that as companies we continue to look at it. And as I said, the UN have the 17 key points, but also, it's going back to your investors, your suppliers, your stakeholders, the people that are buying from you, or using your services. They want to see that investment. They want to see that you are becoming environmentally, social, and governance within that element. So there may be pledges. So if you're currently working towards a certain thing within the ESG framework, you may want to put a commitment or a pledge in to say that you're working towards it. So ESG is a big thing, and it's not going away, guys. It's going to be here forever. So hopefully that's giving you a little bit more information about, why ESG is such a buzzword, why ESG has a purpose within the UK, how do companies in the UK become compliant, but also what ESG actually covers and goes into, and whether it's worth it or not. And, over the next couple of episodes, we will look at this in a little bit more detail. As I said, we'll look at some of the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages. We'll look at the, positives and improvements. We'll cover all sorts of aspects throughout this, including looking at the three separate elements: the environmental, the social, and the governance side, to give you a little bit more insight. So I hope that this episode has given you a little bit more insight. As I said, thank you very much for listening to this episode. And I do feel that the next couple of episodes are going to be quite interesting and engaging on this one. But if you want to take part or have anything to say on the environmental, social, governance side, then please reach out to me and let's get you booked in to one of the episodes. But until then, have an amazing bank holiday. Thank you for listening. And you can always catch up and re-listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next Monday, have a great week.